Hello dear colleagues, my name is Dmitry and I work for the Dmitry Nikitin school, and today with me is Andrew Walkley, and you may know Andrew Walkley as the co-founder of Lexical Lab, which is a language school in London. Andrew is also the author of Outcomes 2nd edition, Perspective. Andrew kindly agreed to be interviewed. Thank you very much.
It's a pleasure.
Because your latest book is about teaching beginners, it's Outcomes Beginners.
Yeah.
My first question, what is actually the difference between beginner and elementary levels?
It's an interesting question. I actually often, when I was, we originally had Outcomes Elementary for a long time, and before that also Innovations Elementary. And people often used to say, oh, it's a bit too difficult.
Mm-hmm.
And that's because I always thought it's elementary and not beginner. So if you're an A1 student, which is what you should be when you start elementary, then if you look in the CFR or something like that, it says basically you can say certain things in very basic ways, talk about yourself in very basic ways, use words for single words or short phrases to communicate, even though you're not very accurate. So in other words, you do have a certain basis in English language when you're elementary. And so for me, I would imagine you'd studied present simple, verb to be, past simple, etc. So do we really need to start from zero again at elementary?
That's true, but you are kind of starting from zero at elementary level anyway, right?
What, with outcomes?
Generally.
No.
It's with recycling.
Yeah, but you could, for example, I wouldn't have a problem. I mean, I think if you looked at innovations elementary compared to outcomes is a bit more traditional.
Mm-hmm.
So like in
That's
innovation
true.
Elementary, I think in the first unit, the students see the word was, for example.
Mm-hmm.
I think I was born.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So for me that's not a problem because I know that the students will have seen it. I don't expect them to be able to say it or necessarily be able to produce it or understand, they've been exposed to it. So what would happen is the students would just see it, they would understand more or less, and they move on. So for me, the elementary shouldn't, yes, in terms of developing, we're going to still be working with very basic grammar, etc. But the students could be seeing things they've seen already at beginner from the first unit.
And Andrew, what about the fundamental principles which are behind teaching beginner students? Do we have some principles for teaching beginners which are different from teaching the rest of the students?
A couple. Obviously I think beginners, in a way, many of the same issues that affect other classes are basically, they're essentially the same. They're still there in beginner, but in beginner they become more extreme. So for example, if you take differential levels, so in beginner classes you will typically have a mixture of levels. It's just that some of the beginners will be absolutely have nothing or almost nothing.
Mm-hmm.
So it's difficult for them to partake at all in the class, where you've got some students, as we know, who will maybe be almost elementary. They've experienced language, maybe they've learnt at school, so they have some distant knowledge of grammar and some words which they just can't put into use. And so the difference is they could maybe follow quite a bit in the class, whereas these people with nothing can almost follow nothing. The same would be true at a higher level. You have a mixture of levels in intermediate, but usually we don't notice that so much because basically they can all function to some degree in those in the intermediate level. So, returning to your question, The difference for me is, firstly, I would have a bit more. The main difference, I think, would be I'd have a bit more teacher-to-student interaction at beginner, because the students can't basically do pair work. They can do pair work, but in a very limited way. So that it would last for maybe 30 seconds, and we still have to do that pair work, because to ensure that all the students get enough opportunity to practice. But we have to accept that it will be very limited. So what we can do then is to kind of repeat some of that pair work as one-to-one. And through that you can also extend a little bit what they are able to say. You can ask follow-up questions, and where you can help them with the answers and these kinds of things.
And you call it dialogue building technique?
Yeah, so yes.
Approach?
Yeah, I mean, I would, with dialogue building, I mean, I do use more of that dialogue building at lower levels. So, which is basically I present a first question, such as where are you from, and then get the answers from different students, and then I kind of respond in the next level, so where are you from? Russia, and I might then say what part. Okay, and then we get the second part, and then maybe have you been there, or is it nice, whichever you want to choose as the next line. You can build up the conversation with the students in that way.
And this extra phrase, they're written down somewhere on the board, right?
Yeah, so you elicit it, you repeat it. So often I'll be repeating it first orally, and then at some point I would write it on the board and use that to remind the students.
While dialogue building at the beginner level, can you come up working with students' language with some high level vocabulary they want to say?
Yeah, sure. So I mean, I think.
What would you do with that?
I would tell them it.
You would tell them?
Yeah. So I think my feeling is, if the students are trying to say it, then give it to them. And if it enables them then to continue the conversation. What I might not do is, if it's particularly high level or unusual, I think that's unlikely at beginner actually. Most of the things they will try and say are fairly basic actually. But if they did, I might tell that student how to say it in English, maybe with translation if I could do it. And I wouldn't write that word on the board for the other students. Whereas if I'm using like teachers to students, the student says, for example, I want to say, can I go to the toilet, for example. I might write that all on the board for all students, because that is going to be useful for all students. And then I might even drill it and practice it for everybody.
Well, I had a very basic conversation, do you have a pet? And the answer was, yes, I have a pet, I have a cat. And the student wanted to say, I adopted her, it was a stray cat and I adopted her a year ago.
Right.
It's quite a high level vocabulary, and it's this kind of vocabulary, well,
yes.
it may not be relevant to all the group.
Exactly, so I definitely wouldn't be writing stray cat on the thing or adopt. I would probably, I might even reinterpret what the student wants to say in a slightly simpler way. So I might put, I found a cat on the street.
Yeah. Good.
And, I found her on the street. I have a cat, I found her on the street. That might be the way I would present it to the rest of the class.
Andrew, thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dimitri.
Have a very good day.
Hope
Bye.
to see you sometime soon. All right, bye.